feel like I should have done this 20 years ago with you two, but time has a habit of just working itself out. Andrew and George Miedecke. Firstly, what nationality is Miedecke?
Comes from northern Germany, southern Denmark.
So you can speak German, can you?
No. My forebears came out in 1880s, jumped ship. They were escaping from conscription in the Franco-Prussian War.
So you've done a bit of research on this.
Yeah, well, family trees happen, you know, older brothers and sisters, mums and dads, they all look up and want to know where we came from.
I lived in Germany for a year after school and I could
Did you
speak
really?
back then. Yeah, I did. And
Give me something.
Ich war in Deutschland für ein Jahr für einen Schüleraustausch. So it means I was in Germany for a year on a student exchange. And when I could speak it, Dad was in a bit of a period of checking up the family history, and so he'd often send me stuff to decipher and translate. This is before Google Translate, so yeah, interesting.
I went to school at New to high school in the Barossa Valley, and German was the language you had to learn.
Yeah.
So it's like, der Schaffner fragt, Petzerot zur Schule. It's about all I remember, and that was like the school bus driver said, here comes the bus. Anyway, so Tasmania is a long way from Germany.
It is.
Why did you find motorsport in Tasmania? Is that where you found it?
It is. Dad ended up in Tasmania. He was a pilot in the war. He was an engineer, and then at uni, and then joined up and was a pilot in the war, flying Sunderlands in the European War, and then Catalinas in the Pacific War.
Wow.
And ended up in Tasmania because he married my mother, and my grandfather on my mother's side had a timber mill and a coal mine.
Yeah.
Both fairly small operations. So my uncle and dad moved to Tasmania with their respective wives, and Dad ran this small coal mine, and my uncle Bill ran the timber mill. And then Dad was always an enthusiast, and Bill was too, and Dad, Longford was going then, and so Dad took me out to Longford. I don't know how old I was, probably 10 or so, and I just loved it. So, that was absolutely hooked on it.
Do you remember thinking at some point in your life, I want to do that?
Yeah. Right then, there was a pivotal moment. I knew I wanted to be good at something, and Mum was into horses. So I thought maybe I knew through family friends a man that had won the gold medal at the Olympics, and I thought he was pretty cool too. So I was in between horses and cars. And I remember I went across the road to get this obstinate bloody horse on a frosty morning in Tasmania. Walked across there in my gumboots, tried to catch this horse, and it just ran from one end of the paddock to the other, and it took me half an hour to catch the thing. And then when I caught it and put a bridle on it, I was trying to stamp on my feet, and it was just a horrible thing. Got a saddle on it, jumped over, went down the street, and I was probably 12 or 13. And as the horse came up, I went down, and a very delicate part of the bloke's academy was in between. Anatomy, I should say.
Academy works as well, George. I think we got the point, didn't we? The old academy, that's going to stick with me now. Enrolled in the academy,
I remember holding on, I nearly fell off this. I thought, I know I want to be good at something, but it's not going to be horses. So that's when the real passion set in for motor racing.
You know, when you think about it, George, I'm going to put it in this perspective. If the horse hadn't stomped on the Rundle Malls, we would have been robbed possibly of one of Australia's most probably underrated motorsport drivers.
Yeah, well, it's been a great for me. I mean, I've loved every part of it. You know, we actually, that's probably not fair. I started racing when I was a kid, go-karting and stuff, and I was sort of okay at it. But to be quick in a kart, you've got to be in it every second week. And my parents had separated. I'd come to Dad's house, we'd go kart racing, come back. I felt like every time, all I ever did was rub, tyre marks off my side pods. and I didn't want to do it anymore. I just wanted to spend some time with my dad.
Yeah.
And so I took up racing a lot later, but it was there from the minute. Dad called me up one day. I was working selling cars at Cole Crawford's in Brookvale on the Northern Beaches, and he said, "Can you get this weekend off? There's a race at Calder Park." And it was just, I was hooked. You know, it was so good.
Were you always that tall? Because karting wouldn't have been easy for you unless you shot up later in life.
Yeah, no, I was fine when I was karting. I was pretty normal size until about 17 or 18. So, yeah, ever since then it's been a problem. Trying to get comfortable in a car has been a problem. You know, you go to a new team and they all underestimate just how long my torso is. Trying to get me low enough in the car is a real issue. But this new car we've got, the Mustang GT4, it's probably about as comfortable as I've ever been, so it's awesome.
Rob Jarvis was raving about that. Tasmania has a wonderful motor racing culture, both on a bitumen and dirt. There's just something about Tasmanians, they love their motor racing culture. How long were you there for until you moved to the mainland to start that and pursue?
Well, I didn't race in Tasmania at all. I was just desperate to do it, but didn't have any money. I went and worked at Savage River in the mines to make money to build a Formula V, and that stalled. And then I was a bit, you know, I was a pretty good kid, but my mother did buy me a one-way ticket out of Tasmania.
A couple of times.
and then when I came back, she bought me another one. But I was working in. I was trying to make money to go motor racing, and the way to do that is, and Mum and Dad weren't going to chip in, and the way to do that is sell stuff. I thought, so I was selling cars in Melbourne, and my brother went guarantor on a personal loan, and I bought a little Formula 3 car.
Personal loan for a Formula 3?
Yeah. How they gave that to me, I don't know. And Pete, my older brother's a pretty rock solid bloke. Anyway, I did a couple of races in that, and that seemed to be pretty fast, but I ran out of money then, and I ended up, after 3 great years in Melbourne, or 2 great years in Melbourne, ended up in Sydney working for a guy named Paul Bray, Brayson Motors, he was a, like he should be, a petrol head, and I started racing an old Volvo 122 rally car at Amaroo and places like that. Yeah, and then.
Because you have a pretty celebrated open wheel chapters in your life, don't you? Why was the open wheel fascination for you?
Oh, that's right. I wanted to be in Formula 1. The only reason I bought the Volvo is because Paul helped me, and so I sold that, and I hit my mother up. I said, "Mum, lend me $6,000. I want to be a professional racing driver, and I'll pay you back." And she said, "Son, I will never give you any money for motor racing." I said, "But," she said, "I will lend you a deposit on a house." So at that time I was selling a car to a valuer that was buying a Holden from me in Parramatta Road, and I said, "If you're going to buy a house with a view to it going up, where would you buy it?" And he said, "Oh, that's easy, Balmain." And I didn't even know where Balmain was. So I was living in Hurstville at the time. So
Not exactly Balmain.
So I went to Balmain, had Mum's $6,000. I bought a house for 12.
12 grand?
No, yeah, 12 grand. It was a big corner terrace. Worked my butt off. Sold cars during the day, but every night, 6 o'clock, into the house and worked till midnight, into bed, back to work at 8 o'clock. But within 6 months, I had this old terrace looking pretty smart, and I sold it for 18 grand. So I had Mum's 6 grand, which I got back, of course, and a 6 grand profit. And there was no capital gain at that time, so I had 12 grand. So I went and bought 2. And did the same thing, and it wasn't long before I had enough. Only a couple of years later, I had enough money to buy a brand new Verano Formula 4, which I did, and then raced. Seemed to be fairly fast in that, and I think I won a race. Second race of the Formula 4 Championship, or the Amaroo Series. I won at Amaroo, and I heard the Grace Brothers, were worth a call, so I called Hans Tiedemann, and he said, "Come in and see me at Grace Brothers." And from there on, I had Grace Brothers sponsorship, and they paid all the bills. They were great. He was a great bloke, and I was Grace Brothers for the next 3 years, and then I hocked everything except the one last house, and went to England, and turned up and knocked on Ron Turinak's door. said, I'm Andrew Miedecke and I'm here to win the championship and, you know, I want to buy a car and all that stuff. He said, how much money have you got, son? And I don't know, I don't remember the number. It had 7. I might have had 27 or 57 or something, 70, I don't know how much money. And I told him, he looked at me and said, you might as well just buy a ticket home, son. And
Wow.
So then I went and bought bits of a march, and Bruce Carey and I put it together, and just, you know, I should have been driving a Ralph, but I bought a march out of spite, and went all right, but really didn't achieve much before I ran completely out of money.
It sounds like you have been a salesman your whole life. Yourself, vehicles, and property.
Yep.
That's aided you pretty well. We've got to thank Mum at this point, because indirectly,
Absolutely.
the horse stepped on the Rundle Malls. She wouldn't buy you a car, but she gave you money to buy a house, which bought you a car. Good on you, Mum.
She was pretty special, really.
I don't think she would have accepted the credit for that either way. But and you've been in sales pretty well your whole life too, George, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I remember I finished school and I went and lived in Germany after I went on a rotary exchange. Went and lived in Germany for a year, and I came back and I was a bit of a loose end. I didn't really know what I was going to do, and I went through the application process at DJ's at David Jones to go and work there as a retail assistant.
Yep.
And one of the staff who was working for Dad called me up, Chris Mansfield, and he said, George, what are you doing? I said, you know, I'm about to go and start work at DJ's. And he said, well, I've got you an interview to sell cars. And I said, look, you know, I'm already in. And he goes, do you want to sell cars or suits? And that said it to me pretty much straight away. So yeah, I went down to work at
Different kind of markup and retail.
Look,
incentives.
it's in the blood, mate. You know, I've been in cars since I was born. You know, Dad had the dealership for 6 years by the time I was born. So
yeah,
it's been a great. You know, I love cars, whether it's racing them, selling them. You know, the vibe I get now from running a dealership with 120 employees and it's cool. It's a great buzz, and I really enjoy it.
motor racing has been good to you, Andrew, but it's also, you've had some pretty risky and close run-ins at times. The New Zealand crash where you broke both of your legs must have been a horrific time in your life.
It was, but there's, you know, with crashes in motor racing, you know, if you're a competitor, you think it'll never happen to you, and if it does, you think it'll never happen again. So
Otherwise, you couldn't do it.
Exactly. Yeah, it's probably means I haven't got much imagination or much in the low grade about. But I don't ever catastrophize. I don't ever think about what might happen. I just do it. And I got back in the car. You know, the legs were pretty badly broken, but I had great care in New Zealand, and I've had no problem since.
Craig said no pins, no steel. It was all like pretty well like a natural process. Is that right?
Yep. Unusual. They don't even do it in New Zealand anymore. I don't know why. I think probably the fee, you know, they like the fees of putting pins in. But anyway, I stepped back in, and apart from having to adjust the pedals on my march because I was a bit shorter, I took 5 laps and I was back on the money. So just get back on with life.
Is it through your New Zealand expeditions that you met the Stone Brothers? How did that all come about?
Yeah, I raced against Ross in the New Zealand Gold. They had their Gold Star, and I used to go and do that because Formula Pacific or Formula Atlantic wasn't really around. 5,000 was strong here, and while I would have given what testicle I had left after the horse to drive a Formula 5000 car, I just couldn't. I didn't see the future in it.
Yep.
So I got into Formula Atlantic at the time, it was called Formula Pacific, and the place to race was Asia, where I went up there quite a lot and made pretty good money, and then spent it in New Zealand, and then later on Formula Pacific in Australia.
There's this phenomenal 6 degrees of separation thing here. So you go the Stone Brothers, you go some guy called Marcus Ambrose, who's also from Tasmania.
Yeah.
Who you end up driving for in a late model since in United States of America. This is a phenomenal 6 degree of separation story, George, isn't it?
Yeah, it was pretty cool. You know, I remember I was racing Utes and Dad knew Marcus.
Which is the pinnacle. I mean, really, I don't know how you aspire to it.
I mean, like late 2000s Utes was about as good as it gets, really.
I reckon.
For somebody that was 6'6" anyway.
Yeah.
And Dad had known Ross Ambrose quite well, and so Marcus was racing NASCAR, and he came back for a PR appearance at Homebush, and Dad had convinced, I don't know if it was through Ross or had spoken to Marcus and sort of got me an intro. Marcus, a lot of the
Through
NASCAR,
Marcus.
Yeah, right, yep.
a lot of the cup drivers then were running their own sort of driver
Yep.
development type thing and bringing in the next guys, and it was very fashionable to have a young bloke in the wings. And I remember being absolutely starstruck. I was like, "Hello, hi Marcus, nice to meet you. You know, it'd be great to chat, but I got to get in the car."
Yep.
And it just happened to be one of those weekends. It was just the best, probably one of the best weekends of driving I've ever had. You know, it was just I won all the races by a mile and obviously made an impression on Marcus. And I was here in the old version of this house, and we've been talking about what was next for my career. We pretty much settled on going to Europe. You know, Andy Prio had given us a bit of
wow.
a hand and helped, made some connections in England, and I was looking at some GT racing. And I was in bed, and it was about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. The phone rings, +1, whatever. I answered it. I said, "Hello?" He goes, "George." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "This is Marcus." I said, "Oh, hi Marcus, how you going?" He goes, "Do you know what you're doing yet?" And I said, "Oh, I think I'm going to go to Europe." And he goes, "Well, I've got you a drive here." He said, "Do you want to be a racing driver?
Or do you want to sell suits?
Or do you want to look like a racing driver?"
Oh, what a great answer. Yep.
And he was a bit miffed that I'd had something else, you know, because he felt
Yeah.
like he'd been doing all this work, and it was basically, you know, hung up on me and called me back. And I remember walking down the hallway to Dad's room and knocking on the door, opened the door, and he was sitting in bed reading his book. I said, "What do I do, Dad?" And Dad said, "Well, you better call him back." And then about 2 weeks later, I was on a plane to America.
So there's two really pivotal phone calls that we just discussed. First one was a guy that called up and said, "Do you want to sell cars or suits?" Second guy said, "Do you want to drive race cars or look
Yeah.
like it?" They're
I've had a lot of good advice. over the
they're
years.
two big forks in the road. What an amazing, wow. Yeah. That's, now, Jason Gomersall's name pops into my head all of a sudden.
Yep.
It's amazing how your brain works, isn't it? Like 2 weeks ago, I was at Sydney Motorsport Park and his son was there racing in the Gazoo
Yeah.
stuff. And Jason's still the most grounded,
Yeah.
you know,
lovely guy.
mega software billionaire that I know. Like, what a wonderful person. He was pivotal in your Ute days as well, wasn't
Totally. Yeah. So I had a bit of
Well, a bit the other way to start.
Yeah.
Jason had just started in Utes,
he? Yes.
and he needed a hand, and he's one of those quiet, nice guys.
Yeah.
And George gave him a hand by going through the data, I think.
Yeah, right.
I said, "This is what you do here," and
Yep.
and that's where it all started.
I had,
Okay.
I had a bit of a side hustle in Ute, so I had it because I heard Beardo was doing this in Carrera Cup, and basically I was offering at a pretty cheap rate.
Yep.
I think it was $1,000 a weekend. I was doing like coaching with other drivers in
Yeah.
the series.
Yep.
And so I had those big gun guys. What were their names?
Yep. Yeah, Burnett's and the Van Twests.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And Jason was just getting started out, and we just hit it off immediately. You know,
Yeah.
Such a nice guy. So I would do the track walk with him on the Thursday. I used to have to do like 4 or 5 track walks every Thursday, you know, with the different drivers
Yeah,
I
yeah.
had in, and then go through the data and video and stuff. And I remember one time I had lost a sponsor or something like that, and Jason just said, "How much does it cost to be on the car, on your car?"
Yep.
And from there, yeah, that relationship started, and he was there through the end of the Ute career. And then when I went to America was kind of two halves for me. The first half I really struggled, you know.
Yeah.
I remember calling Dad and saying, I don't think I'm any good. You know,
Yeah.
I don't think I can do
This
this.
was in North Carolina, wasn't it?
Yeah, because the first car I drove was a real heap, you know. It was,
We were stitched up.
we were stitched up big time, and you know, some classic. They might talk slow, but they don't think slow.
Yeah, yeah.
And I got to the end of the first year, and I was saying to Dad, I don't think I've got it. What do I do? I had the same conversation with Jason, and both of them said, I think you guys got together or something, but you said basically, you've been there long enough now, George. Go and buy two races with the best team. You know all the people and everything, and see what happens. And I went and talked to Fathead Racing from you know wherever they were, the Forest City.
Yep.
and they
real.
Yep, good old boys.
But
Yep.
they were the Hendrick Motorsports of late models,
Yep.
you know, and they weren't even sure they wanted to take me, so they said, we'll test you, and if you're good enough, we'll run you. And test got rained out, and the practice got rained out, and so the first time they said, look, we'll just run you in this little race. And I remember, like, distinctly pulling out on the track, and right behind me was the guy who'd been whooping my ass all year. And I let him go, and then I warmed the car up, and then I went dunk, dunk, dunk past him and just off into the distance. And I thought, where has this car been my whole life? And then won the next 2 races, and yeah, that launched the second year in America.
And you didn't stay after that? There was no
Yeah,
longer term proposition long term for you there?
No, the second year went really well. I did a touring category called the UARA Stars, which is like a cars tour now.
Yeah.
And I finished second, highest rookie ever, all of that. But really, they're quite insular. They like Americans over there. They support Americans.
But really, this is around, what year was that? 2009?
That was 2011.
11, but our timing wasn't good, or George's timing wasn't good, because the GFC had hit America hard.
Yeah, right.
And a lot of that disposable spending,
Yep.
and the car manufacturers are all going broke.
Yep.
And we went over there, and Marcus was very supportive on the basis that you probably get picked up, George would probably get picked up by one of the manufacturers into their junior teams.
Mm-hmm.
But because of the financial repercussions, and we couldn't predict it when we went
Yeah.
there, or George
Yeah.
went there, but those drives, that whole area just evaporated. There was a bit around for diversity kids, and you know, and there were some pretty good drivers came out of it.
Yeah.
But
yeah, Bubba Wallace was on the Revolution Racing thing when I was over there.
yeah,
We were good mates back then.
yeah, right. And you know, so it just the possibility of a proper drive didn't seem to be showing up. So we thought, hang on, we'll bring him back, you know, or George should come back.
Well, the great thing, because of the Marcus connection, we'd made it look like I'd conquered the world. You know, the PR. Mark Walker was doing the PR.
Oh,
and
yeah.
It was fantastic.
Yep.
And between Marcus and Mark and myself, we were working pretty hard on making it look as big
Yep.
back home as we could make it look. And so when I came back to Australia, I really felt like the sort of people would talk to me. You know, I remember going and sitting down with Gary Rogers, and he said, "I don't know much about you, but I hear you can drive." You know, and all of that was really cool. And so all of that racing in America, what it did was it sort of springboarded me back into Australia at a higher level than when I'd left.
Yeah. And it would seem to have been a fairly obscure move, considering you guys were circuit racing predominantly left and right. But then to go to the good old boys and run, you know, flat and banked ovals, because a lot of that stuff is not super high banked either. There's some real myriad of tracks you would have raced at.
Yeah.
Did you do much like sort of, you know, Watkins Glen or any sort of road course stuff at all, or was it all oval?
Barely any. I had a really good opportunity, and probably in hindsight I should have explored it a bit further, but had a good opportunity in an IMSA. It's like I suppose their version of what GT4 is now.
Yeah, sports car, yep.
And so I tested at Barber, which I think IndyCar were racing there on the weekend, and that was really cool, and that was exciting. And at Homestead, I tested for Stevenson Motorsports, which was cool. But I did one road course race. I did a race in the ARCA series for Venturini.
Yeah, okay.
And yeah, I led the whole thing and got caught up on a lap car with 2 laps to go and came second, which grates me to this day. But yeah, it was pretty cool.
Jason Gomersall
Sponsored that, yeah.
Yeah, he was just great.
Yeah.
Jason was only a phone call. George said, "Could I do it?" And I said, "Well, I'm running out of budget. You better see if you can get somebody else in there, either as well or instead of." And George rang Jason, and Jason said, "Go for it." I
remember clearly then when I was talking to Jason, actually, because myself and Brandon McReynolds, whose old man used to crew chief Dale Earnhardt.
Larry McReynolds.
Yeah, as a commentator now.
Yep.
Yeah, and Brandon's Ross Chastain spotter.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, we'd broken
Does Ross Chastain need a spotter? He just goes to the wall, doesn't he, and runs it around the top.
Well, we'd broken into Concord Speedway, the two of us, because we weren't doing anything, and I was racing there later, and Concord's fast. It's a tri-oval, really high bank. It's super fast but quite bumpy.
Yep.
And so Brandon had raced there a few times, and he and I, we jumped the fence and we'd broken into Concord just to have a walk around on a weekday. And I remember my phone ringing, and again I looked and it was like an Australian number, and I picked it up and it was Jason, and that was he was basically just calling me back to give me the green light. Like it was really cool. I remember thinking, sitting in this speedway by myself, or with Brandon, and looking around and thinking, how good is this? Because the ARCA car is amazing. It's got 800-900 horsepower, and not much in the way of any creature comfort. So that was a really cool race, and to go on live pit stops and national anthems and all that sort of stuff. It was great.
Million miles from a dreams of a Formula One career, Andrew. Your kid's running in Hickory, North Carolina, with the good old boys, and here you were dreaming of, taking on the Formula One world. Who was your Formula One hero, if you had one? And how did you find out about Formula One? Because these days it's easy, right? It's all over TV, it's everywhere. Where did you learn much about Formula One?
Well, the Tasmania series was Formula One stars spending their summer in Australia, right? And a couple of races in New Zealand. So Sterling Moss was my early, and he wrote a book called something about speed, and I don't know how many times I've read that.
Yeah.
Probably 50. And he's pretty cool too, and he always had good looking girls with him too.
Was that I think James Hunt was the king of that, wasn't he?
A bit later, yeah.
Yeah. It's the beautiful part about motor racing that there's so many twists and turns. The track is the least part of the turns and twists part of the equation, because who would have thought that you would be? Because, obviously with Ross and Jimmy Stone, having Marcus racing, with them, and that connection coming back in with Tasmania and New Zealand with you bringing them over, and then George ends up driving in, with Marcus's help in the States. There's so many beautiful connections there.
There are. But you talk about ovals and road racing, I think essentially I love the competition. I love the racing. And if you're talking about competition, Saturday night at Hickory, when you're doing 19-second laps, and it's just on, and it's great racing, and it's taught George a lot of stuff. He's lightning fast from the get-go. I used to go over there. I was over there for probably 2/3 of George's races. I bought a hole in the air in V Australia at the time, and I used to go to a lot of George's races, and it was great. I just loved it, And the thing that George got out of it, he's got so much seat time. But you can go testing a set of tyres is $250, and you go and you run through a couple of new sets of tyres and do qualifying semis and all that sort of stuff, which has all been very valuable for his education as a racing driver. And the other thing that I thought of too is that he goes and adapts and lives in a foreign country essentially on his own. That's part of his growing up, and he did well on that side of it too. George still has a lot of great friends in the States, and
you make friends. You make friends for life in America. You just do. They're very simple people and very beautiful people. When I say simple, they're not in simple ways, but they love their racing, they love their country, they love their sport, they live their sport. We love sport, they live it.
Yeah.
Big difference. There are so many things to cover in your career on your own, Andrew. Let alone the stuff, with George, who's created his own career as well. But the 2-litre touring car stuff in particular, that phenomenal era when the Sierras were just rocket ships. So you just smiled then? You had this little... What a phenomenal time in your life that must have been.
Sure was.
Were they as fun as they looked?
Absolutely. They were.
So that smile, George? It's like... But at the time, if you were a purist, a touring car guy, that was the worst thing imaginable. It was like, what just happened?
It had some little pommy 2-litre thing rounding up a V8 Commodore. And
with a Volvo out there as well, and an RX-7s, and it's like, who just stole the keys to the ship?
Yeah.
But that created their own culture, didn't they?
They sure did. And there are lots and lots of fans, still for those Group A cars, those Group A Sierras. They were the business. They were a small car, 1,100 kilos, and was at the time when we first started, they were probably 450 horsepower, but that grew, but power to weight was great. And I remember in the first part of my time in Sierras, we ran, there was a Sierra Cosworth, which was about 300 horsepower.
Yep.
And the Commodore was never going to just blow by us, and we'd probably be a bit lighter and handling a bit better. And then overnight, when they sent that kit out, which was basically a turbocharger like the size of a big dinner plate, and we bolted that on the side, man, those things just took off. And I remember seeing those Commodores and just blowing by one up Mountain Straight. It was great.
That's a really sadistic way that you laughed then, because you were just like, eat that, Brocky. I mean, and Brocky, he had to capitulate as well, right? Because he ended up in one as well.
Yeah.
So everyone saw the writing on the wall.
Absolutely. There was absolutely no choice. If you wanted to be competitive, you had to have a Sierra. That was it. And then later on, you had to have Nissan, but that was a different kettle of fish, because you needed a factory to run one of those. But the Sierra, most people could run.
The BMW was pretty sweet too. Like Jimmy Richards, that JPS car is just anything JPS was stunning there, wasn't it?
It was. They were particularly, with Frank Gardner, they were particularly well engineered, and all the help from Germany, and those things were turning 11 and 12,000 revs, and close to 400, 300, late 300 horsepower, maybe 400 even. That's amazing for a little car, and then the handle like all get out. So they were good, but nothing beats grunt. And every time they come to a straight, and you give us a Ford Sierra sniff at 500 horsepower, it's gone.
Wow. What was it like to sit on pole at Bathurst?
It was. I didn't ever sit on pole at Bathurst. I got lap record.
Okay.
You led the start of.
Yeah, I thought Craig said in the EXO.
The OXO.
The OXO.
I started fifth, but we were pretty new. It was a tiny little team. It was Don Smith, who was a legend in New South Wales and Australian motor racing, and a very good friend of Bo Seaton's. Les Laidlaw was my mechanic, and a team of great, willing guys. And we were in a tent out the back. We were in the stars, and we just rolled this little car along and qualified, I think, fifth, and just got a reasonable start. But then after a lap or two, I thought, I can pass this guy here. So I remember going past Andy, and then up past the first of the Eggenberger cars, and then I got to the lead, and Steve Soper was driving the Eggenberger car. And Steve and I had a fantastic dice, because he's a really good driver, and we had a really good, clean race for a few laps. And then I just left him and went down the road, and it was great. But the problem for us is that Don was my co-driver, and he was a great guy, and as I said, a motorsport institution. But he was 7 seconds a lap slower. Right. And so it was never going to last. Once I got out in my steps, and right at the end of the stint, the alternator stopped charging, so I wheeled in, and that was the end of our race, really. I mean, we still circulated and we still raced, but we weren't going to win it anymore.
You mentioned Amaroo Park before. I mean, Oran Park, Amaroo Park, Lakeside, some of those circuits that are long gone now, that you spent some of the best years of your life at, I would imagine.
Sure did.
Do you ever think back and think how incredibly... I remember the last race at Oran Park. I mean, it was terrible. But the thing I do remember was Lucas Dumbrell. Unfortunately, that was pretty tragic in itself. But the images and the Utes were almost like the spiritual home at Oran Park. But what an amazing, list of tracks you've raced at.
Yeah, and Oran Park especially was just a fantastic piece of road. But as was Lakeside. As was Amaroo, its own way. It was a Saturday night racing of Sydney, wasn't it? Except it was Saturday afternoon. But you would go. People would go there with their picnic, and they'd watch the races, which tends to happen a bit less now.
Yeah.
But they were great. And they bred a whole bunch of very competitive racing drivers from that area.
you know, there was such iconic voices that were attached to that era as well. I mean, Mike Raymond was certainly, I think, the absolute grandmaster of that stuff. But there was so many, you know, Gary Wilkinson and people like that, and
Great guy,
Will Hagen, John Smales.
Yeah, Will could pronounce my name.
Well, he's
still cares.
He's meticulous for detail, Willie. So he would get right over people that didn't.
Yeah.
So there were some wonderful voices of your generation as well, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was. Yeah. And they, you know, every one of those people, you know, Will and Wilco would come slipping through the pits, and they'd have a bit of a chat and say, you know, they'd know the background, you know. So
yeah. Even the other day, last weekend, I was at the TA2 round, and you know, a couple of the boys from Dream Racing are working away in the car, and laying under the car is Glenn Seaton.
Wow.
And I just go, thank God guys like that still love it, George, you know, because Cito's, I mean, just one of the icons of the sport. As a Ford guy, like, you know, I'd walk through fire for Glenn Seaton. So there's just been so many of those wonderful guys that still love it like this guy still does.
Yeah. I remember I had a really hard fight with Aaron for the TA2 championship a few years ago. And while we were we had the knives sharpened as much as we possibly could against those boys, I remember Glenn was very kind. He came over and shook my hand, and he said, "I appreciate you coming, because it's forced my boy to lift his game a bit, and we were both good like that."
Yeah.
So it's great. I mean, to be honest, I've realised, I reckon more in the last year, that I only really enjoy racing properly when my old man's there. Like he had a shoulder op at just before the first round of GT4, and I was desperate to have him there because he's got such a, you know, we're very similar in a lot of ways, but his background has meant that he's very different from me in a lot of ways as well. And so he fills a lot of the gaps that I feel like I have, and he can contribute. You know, he's such a good team leader, and his racing brain never stops. And so, like, when faced with the prospect of potentially not having him at Phillip Island, I was packing it a little bit. So I made sure he was going to be there, and to his credit, he came. So yeah, it was really good.